Okay, well, we are at the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back. We're now on session 4 of our Climate Adaptation Planning and Practices course for Ohio. We had a week off last week to kind of ask questions and check in with instructors or read ahead to the next step. So I know a lot of you have made some significant progress in that time off. Your instructors today are myself and Kristen Geisting. Erin is also available to chime in and answer questions and make comments. But I just want to acknowledge that, you know, this course is made possible by a number of partners, including Natural Resources Conservation Service, Ohio State University Extension, and NIAC. So thanks to everyone putting on this course.
Patricia?
So yes.
Just so you know, you're in presentation mode.
Are you seeing the wrong screen?
We're just getting your next slides and notes as well. It's in presentation.
Okay, yeah, so let's see here.
That's all right. They're written so tiny, we can't read it anyway.
How's this going? Well,
screen.
It's more for you to be able to see what I'm talking about here. So great. Okay, thanks, Erin. Today's session then is going to be a step 3 discussion. So what did you do in step 3? And then we'll move into step 4. So we'll give an overview of adaptation options and selecting adaptation actions. And then we'll cover our assignment for next week. And then as usual, we'll stick around for any questions after the class. Okay, so last week we covered step number 3, which is evaluating management objectives considering climate change. And this is the step where you bring together your management goals and objectives that you identified in step 1, and then also the climate change impacts that you identified in step number 2. And you think about how climate change will affect your management goals and objectives. So in this step, we weigh the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents. And we also determine the feasibility of meeting our management objectives using our usual management. So again, this is the step where we really connect climate change to our current management actions, or if you're still in the brainstorming phase, your intentions. And here is where we evaluate whether climate change makes it more difficult to achieve those objectives, and if there are any climate related opportunities that might make it easier to achieve our management objectives. So if the objectives no longer seem feasible given climate change, we can actually go back to step number 1 and modify our objectives so that we feel confident moving forward with those. Otherwise, when we get to step 4, we can implement adaptation actions that can make it easier to meet our management goals and objectives. So step 3 was also evaluating feasibility of achieving your objectives, given the challenges and opportunities that you've identified using your business as usual management. Something to note is that feasibility can be determined for individual or multiple time frames. So maybe some of you were thinking about meeting your goals in the short term versus over the long term. So then we rate our feasibility by weighing all of our challenges against our opportunities. And so if you remember, a rating of high means that our existing management options can be used to overcome the challenges for meeting management objectives under climate change, or that opportunities might even outweigh our challenges. And then if you choose moderate, then some of those challenges to meeting management objectives under climate change have been identified, but these can probably be overcome by using your existing management options, or additional efforts might be necessary to counteract key challenges or promote some of those new opportunities. And then low feasibility is really when your existing management options are not sufficient to overcome climate related challenges. So, and we provided some examples that help show how this step is similar to, but different than step number 2. So where step number 2 is identifying the site level impacts, step number 3 requires us to go back to step number 1 and reconsider those management objectives. So your challenges and opportunities really need to express your ability to meet those objectives rather than just talk about the climate change impacts. For example, if we have an objective to provide turtle habitat, then the challenge is that turtles rely on consistently wet sites throughout the year, and climate change will make it harder to maintain those sites over the long term. However, an opportunity is that we're currently in the middle of a significantly wetter period in our climate record. And so over the short term, we have the opportunity to provide enough habitat to stabilize the turtle population. So for this reason, the managers rated this objective as high feasibility in the short term and low to moderate in the long term. And that's because there's so much uncertainty about how much conditions will change. Another example focuses on the objective to improve forest bird habitat and the challenges associated with losing a whole functional group of tree species, the conifers. So these managers know as an opportunity, however, that as long as they can provide the right structure with better adapted tree species, then the habitat requirements will probably still be met. And so for this reason, they rated their management objective overall as having high feasibility. So I hope that gives you a better sense of what we're looking for in step number 3. And now we really want to hear more about what you came up with. So for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll dive into our discussion session to explore your challenges, your opportunities, and then how you rated the feasibility of your objectives from step number 3. So last week was a break week, and I think that most everybody was able to check in with one of your co-instructors. So thank you so much for doing that. We think you're all making really good progress and asking really great questions. So today we'd like to hear from each of you how you rated the feasibility of meeting your management objectives, given climate change. And what are those specific challenges and opportunities that factored into that rating? So in the adaptation workbook, you are given the opportunity to evaluate your challenges and your opportunities for each of your management objectives. Depending on the size and complexity of your project, you might have more than a few objectives. So if it's easier for you, just pick 1 or 2 or even 3 of your most important objectives to discuss today. So we're going to do another annotate activity. So if you remember how to use the annotate function, I just want you to use that stamp tool to indicate how you rated your objectives, and you can mark different ratings for different objectives. So just pick 1 to 3, and I see folks are using that mark already. So if you don't remember, you have a toolbar where you can find your little annotate button. If you push that, then you find your stamp button, and you can choose an arrow, a check mark, a heart, whatever you want to record how you rated your management objectives. So I'll give you just a minute or two to do that. Okay, is anybody still working on it? You can go ahead and keep adding them. So far, it looks like we have folks sticking to the moderate feasibility and the high feasibility categories. So that's a good sign. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the discussion portion of this, and folks can keep adding marks. I noticed that some people marked high feasibility here. So would someone like to share why they came up with that rating? Was it because you had more opportunities than challenges? Or did you just have minimal management challenges? What were you thinking there? And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'll go first. I was waiting, but I'll go first.
Thanks, Annie.
So I think I'm in a really good position in that I do have existing forest, but I'm at this transition period. So the management piece for me was saying, all right, we can make decisions based on the high end of the feasibility of this and set aside maybe a little bit for low or moderate feasibility as sort of test areas. So when we get ready to finish the forest management plan, we can say, all right, there are these species over here and they may have some jeopardy. So that could be low feasibility or moderate, but we're going to do some other kind of companion stuff with that, or swales or whatever, and see if we can up that. But so that's the position we're in, is in the design phase of it. So I felt like almost everything was really high feasibility, and it gave us a chance as in the management piece to say we have room, we have wiggle room to play with some of it. One of the ideas is that we have a pond that never would hold water, and it used to have a really nice vernal pool, and now it's less. And so we're in the management piece and the objectives, the goal is to take the runoff from a new tiny house we're building and run the runoff from the water collection overflow into this pond, put a pond liner on it to keep it from leaking, and then begin to address how we're going to attract wildlife, and maybe have some space where it is wet all the time, but not a lot of water for things like turtles, and do their do-si-do in the vernal pools. So really putting more effort into that. And then also we're at a point where we can choose species that we want to integrate into the forest and into our food forest. And so that gives us opportunity to say, all right, we know what we've got to work with, but then what do we want to put in along with those things? So one of the things, an example might be that we're going to work with figs. It's a high-end product, and if we were to sell the figs, and so what can we do to put figs in a few different places, in a few different environments, and see how they're gonna weather this? And I've been playing around with that with figs out in the open, but then if we had them on the edge of a forest or in the new food forest we're creating from scratch. So we want to introduce high-end products because we need to create a way to make a living. So we're still in this sort of planning, dreaming, hey, we can just play with this. But we have then the barrier, or that's not the right word, sort of like this bar that we want to set for ourselves to try to be in high visibility section of the management. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's a great example. We often hear in a lot of our transition or restoration projects where people are, starting with a clean slate or starting from square one, that climate change provides this opportunity to consider what you're going to plant there, and a wider variety of species that, might be adapted to those future conditions. So that's really cool that you're in that place and you're able to think about those species. Great, thanks. Anyone else with high feasibility? What makes your job so easy?
Vicki and I are in high feasibility, so jump on in, Vicki. Very similar to what Annie found. Vicki's lucky in that her riparian area is already covered with oaks, and so we think they'll be okay, but we're not quite sure. So they're good anchor species for now, but there's an understory that she can start to transition and have those be the climate adapted species. So in case the oaks don't do so well, there will be the next succession along the riparian zone, and make sure that area is protected and the habitat is there. Vicki also has a really nice wetland vernal pool type of area, and she's going to expand that and make it a little larger and create a nice buffer around that to also create the habitat to do that. So that place is already there, the low spot's already there, it's already a place where water wants to pool and pond anyway, so that's a good opportunity. It's just a matter of expanding that buffer zone for the future, and that could also help to capture and store and treat water on site too, and help clean up some of the water that might then make it into the Lake Erie watershed, which is a high priority for Vicki to do her part on her property to protect Lake Erie. And then in the short term, we've got some challenges with climate and increasing weather and managing weed species. And but we feel overall the opportunity outweighs those challenges, in that Vicki wants a variety of natives and species adapted to the soil and the soil moisture regime that's out there. So she's willing to allow the land to go through its natural succession and have a variety of plant species there that can or can't be adaptable, and is willing to let some go as they fade in and some come up as long as they're native and contribute to the overall goals of the property. Vicki, did you have more to add there?
No, I think you did a pretty good job. I mean, it's the other advantage that I have is that this has been done. I've seen it at its peak about 6-7 years ago when my mom had everything really cleaned up. And so the degrading of the property with her dementia, we can get it back. And the trick is going to be raising revenue. So thank you, Annie, for bringing that up. But we think we have some solutions to doing that by creating a native nursery and having a wetland protection program that would pay the basic bills, and reaching out to partners in the area like the Black Swamp Bird Observatory, and raising revenue in the ecotourism sector to help further protect the land and the watershed, and get people invested. So I feel like the opportunities are, I have from the beginning that the opportunities are endless, and the challenges are, I mean, they're there, but they're not insurmountable.
And I'll just, one last thing is, I think that Vicky has a really interesting idea, and as it goes to land rental rates, which is a thing in agriculture, right? And so she can rent her land for a different purpose other than growing corn and soybean crops, right? So she's thinking through that. She can still have a transition, and she can still have her end outcome for conservation and climate adapted conservation, and still try to generate a revenue even through a land rental service to education facilities or people who want to grow cut flowers or those sorts of enterprises.
Okay, awesome. So I think your kind of triage approach to invasive species is really interesting and really savvy. Are there any invasive species that if you detected them, you would shift your resources and say, absolutely not those?
Well, we have, I mean, unfortunately, the loosestrife, the teasel, the Canada thistle, canary reedgrass are problematic again. And dogwood, the gray dogwood is problematic, but it's just because it hasn't been burned. You know, I mean, we need to get out and burn, mow and burn, but we want to take species inventories first, because we don't want to, that's the catch-22. There's a series of catch-22s here, in that we want species inventory, but we really need to burn and mow and probably do a little chemical work too. But I would love for a way to take the teasel and cultivate it off-site, because teasel has been studied for a long time as a curative for Lyme disease. And I really want to jump into that market. So, but I don't know how to do it, you know, without it taking over the prairie. It has to be in a hoop house, or, you know, I don't know. That's a challenge, but that's a future challenge.
Okay,
So
thank
yeah,
you.
This is Laura.
that there are species that gotta go.
Can you explain why
ahead,
you
Laura.
would want to burn dogwood?
Pardon me?
Could you explain why you want to burn dogwood?
Because it's taking over the prairie.
But I thought you were willing to go with natural succession. So should it be dogwood?
If I don't mow and burn the dogwood at this point, I won't have a prairie. So I'm willing to go through the success, a natural succession to a degree, I guess. It's not, I'm not willing to have a dogwood forest. I'm just not.
So Vicky has an area, a management zone on her property dedicated to hardwoods and dedicated to tree species. The dogwoods happen to be growing in a place where she wants to be dedicated to a native plant and cover crop seed nursery. And most of those are forbs, grasses, flowering prairie plants, medicinals.
Yeah, we have a lot of milkweed. We have 3 varieties of milkweed, and we've been approached to be part of it, to be considered for an enhanced monarch habitat study. And if the dog would come in and eradicate all that prairie area, then our milkweed goes away and our monarch habitat goes away. So we do have to do management. So, you know, nothing's black and white here.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Okay, let's hear from a couple other projects. I'm guessing you guys may have rated your objectives as moderate feasibility for one reason or another. Who would like to volunteer to tell us what you were thinking there?
I can go.
Thank
So this-
you.
Yeah, this is us from Agraria. So we're trying to transition the 30 acres into silvopasture. And I think our biggest challenge is really just the precipitation and like controlling water and the increased drought risk in the coming years. So I feel like for us, what makes it more moderate is like if we do it slowly instead of trying to transition the entire thing at once. And planting all the trees at one time. I think we should do patches and we should go from the existing tree line outward. And I think for us, our biggest constraint is really just going to be funding and labor for the irrigation system if we do decide to put in an irrigation system for the trees. So I guess like, again, it's really just going to be water for us. But I think what I really like is there's a section of that field that's already pretty wet. And so I think that gives us an opportunity to like kind of experiment with more like species that like wet feet. So like I'm excited for like different kinds of silvopasture plantings and just trying to experiment with like how we can control the water. Like I've heard from Mark, something like a keyline plow or even like just planting along the contours. We're less concerned about getting like, you know, high yields and more concerned about just getting like a demonstration site set up. So I think that gives us a little more flexibility in terms of how we can like plant things and how we can experiment really. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Yep. So we hear that a lot. That's why we kind of keep the financial considerations like as a separate box in the workbook because, you know, going through the workbook, you can see how your adaptation actions would definitely benefit your expected climate change impacts. And so you've got that captured beautifully. And then, you know, you have to check back into reality sometimes and question how exactly you'll pay for all of that. So we keep that in a separate box. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else who had moderate feasibility? We have just a couple more minutes for our discussion session. So anyone else want to talk about why they chose moderate instead of high or low?
I could.
Thanks, Petra.
So one of our issues is that we have basically 100% dead ash among the wetlands there from emerald ash borer, and that has opened up the canopy partially. But the question is whether there is enough light that would allow for planting other trees that can grow up as really canopy trees. So, and of course, it'll take a long time. So we are planning to do a little bit more of a detailed assessment and see whether there's other already somewhat larger saplings in there that could grow to just better understand where things are. And on one first quick test, it's like, it looks almost like 50% of the canopy trees were ash and they were cut down. So it's quite a bit. So that's why we said that may be moderate feasibility. And then with changes in moisture and temperature increase and so forth, the stability of the wetlands itself is somewhat in question because the hydrology all the way around is totally altered because it's surrounded by roads that are drained into storm sewers. Whether or not something like that could be reverted back, I have no idea. I'm not a hydraulic engineer. Be curious to learn more about it, but that's sort of why we picked moderate. And I think both Laura and I picked the same thing. Laura might want to comment in addition.
I picked moderate because more of the uncertainty of some of the species we might want to plant. And this is a forested area in a very heavily urban shopping area. So ozone and air pollution, like elms don't do well typically in those areas. So yeah, just uncertainty, I guess, is my reason. I'm not so concerned about the hydrology because vernal pools are usually isolated wetlands. And I think this was just a weird year that we had with the snow melting early and things like that. So I'm not quite as concerned about missing 1 year for our breeding salamanders, but so I'm not sure we need to change our hydrology, but just the uncertainty of growing.
Well, thank you all for sharing. At this point, it is time to move on. Before we jump into step number 4, though, I just want to provide a minute to answer any lingering questions you might have about step number 3, or getting that information into the workbook. Any questions?
I had a question because although it's not necessarily related to climate, it's related to an opportunity. So like our partners at Ohio Department of Natural Resources are willing to stop mowing a significant amount of lawn and let us naturalize that, which then will allow us to expand the canopy and provide more shade over some of the road and things like that. So is that where you count opportunities? It seemed like it was only about, when I really read it, it was only, I should only put climate change things in there.
That's a good question. I could see a number of places where that information would fit in. So I guess if you kind of have your project laid out, and this is going to be something additional that you're doing, you could probably bring that in. It's not technically an adaptation strategy, but it's going to be in addition to the area that you're already managing. So you could incorporate it that way and say, we're going to use this property to expand our landscape, and that's, part of your adaptation strategy. Or you could go back to step number 1 and just incorporate that unit as a unit in your workbook so that you can then, develop objectives for that unit and then take that all the way through the workbook.
Okay.
So
thanks.
Probably that would be best, because you are adding that additional land to your project area. And then you don't have to do it all right away as part of this course. You can do it at, kind of on your own schedule. And then, as more information becomes available, you can just add that to the adaptation workbook.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's exciting. Great. Okay. Well, next I'm going to hand it over to Kristen, and she is going to take us through step 4. Take it away, Kristen.
You want me to go ahead and share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So it's great to see the discussion and see how well everyone's projects are developing and hear more about all the work that you've been doing. This week, we are moving on to step 4. So this is where we will identify climate adaptation actions that are designed to respond to those climate change challenges and opportunities that you identified in step 3. So in this step, we have a number of what we call adaptation menus that provide strategies, approaches, and examples of adaptation tactics that you can select and modify and get creative with as needed. So NIAX has developed a range of these adaptation menus in collaboration with some of our other partners to help guide folks in the process of exploring and developing adaptation actions. You can find these adaptation menus actually embedded into the online workbook, as well as additional menus at the link at the bottom of the page. The adaptation menus are essentially organized lists of possible actions that you can pick and choose from to address specific problems. They're organized in a hierarchy going from broader approaches to more specific tactics. And we have different menus focusing on a variety of topics and disciplines, but I think most of you will probably be using either the forestry menu or the agriculture menu. There's a possibility that you may use both depending on the scope of your project. So just like a menu at a restaurant, you don't want to pick everything on the menu or it will be way too much. You really want to use the adaptation menus to pick and choose the strategies and approaches that make the most sense for meeting your goals and objectives and that apply to your specific location. The menus cover some broad ideas that will likely be applicable to your site, but the expectation is that you'll also use your own expertise to articulate the specific actions that will be most relevant to your project and location. So we want to encourage you to think of the menus as a starting point for getting ideas, but then feel free to get more creative and even more specific with those ideas. So the adaptation menus can help us to address challenges in implementing adaptation by connecting these broader ideas to more specific, tangible, on-the-ground actions. They can also help us make our actions more intentional and kind of connect the dots. It's also a really useful way to help you communicate your ideas more clearly, and it's a great source for boosting creativity as you're working through this process. The menus can also help give you an idea of the bigger picture. It allows you to really think about what you're trying to accomplish by taking those specific actions on the landscape. So right now, all this might feel a little bit abstract without actually looking at the menus. So let's talk just a little bit more about that. So the earlier menus, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, those are built into the workbook, but we also have additional newer menus, which are those listed on the right side of the screen here. And you can find those menus online. So if you feel like any of these topics might be relevant for your project, you can check those out. So feel free to explore any of the menus here. But then we would encourage you probably to focus just on one or maybe two of the menus that would be most relevant for the work that you're doing. As part of your homework this week, we'll be asking you to watch a short video covering the topics of resistance, resilience, and transition. So I won't go into too much detail here. I just want to introduce this spectrum of adaptation options. Each of these concepts is related to how we're choosing to deal with change. So the change is either being resisted or accommodated or promoted. The resistance approach seeks to protect against change and is generally thought of as more of a short-term strategy or is for areas with lower intensity impacts. The resilience option, that kind of recognizes that we can't really prevent change from happening on our site, but we can manage it in a way that will help the system bounce back after a disturbance. And this approach will also really embrace or allow for a certain level of change. And then with that final option, the transition option, we're accepting that change might be so great that our system's identity might transform significantly, but we're also acknowledging that we can help play a role in facilitating that change in a positive way. So as you're working on your project, it can be helpful to think about where you might fall on this spectrum from resistance to resilience to transition. So this is the video that we'll ask you to watch as part of your homework for the week. It's going to take a deeper dive into those concepts that I just mentioned, and it will also help set the context and the rationale for step 4. So please take a little bit of time to check that out, and it will be sent out. There will be a link to that video in the follow-up email for this week. So just to zoom out a little bit on this whole process, those broad adaptation options are part of the logical train of thought that we've been working through in this process so far. And this diagram is just a nice way of visualizing the intentionality of the process that we've been going through in developing adaptation actions. So starting with setting our management goals and objectives, then looking at those climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, as well as our challenges and opportunities. And the menus that we're introducing as part of step 4 will help us intentionally define our path going forward by helping to connect the climate vulnerabilities, risks, and challenges we have identified to our on-the-ground adaptation responses. And this pie chart is just demonstrating that oftentimes the climate adaptation actions we're developing are the same actions that we may already be taking, but climate change just makes those actions even more critical. And then other actions that we come up with might be small tweaks that will improve effectiveness. And then finally, other adaptation actions might be totally new ideas. Maybe they're wild and crazy, really different from anything you've considered in the past. So all of these approaches are equally useful and valid. Step 4 is about exploring what actions can be taken to enhance the ability of the project area to adapt to expected changes and to help us meet our management goals. So this is the time to really plan out what you're going to do in response to climate change and to think about how you're going to address your challenges and take advantage of your opportunities. Some of you may have come into this course already having some ideas about what those actions might be, or maybe the work that you've been doing as part of this course over the last few weeks has prompted you to start thinking about these things for the first time. So either way, the first step is to choose an adaptation menu. And for this course, most likely you'll be using either the forestry or the agriculture menu. But like I said before, there are several other menus available. So feel free to check those out if you think that they might be relevant for the work that you're doing. Each menu generally contains around 10 strategies, and then those strategies will feature different approaches that are a bit more specific. You can then build off of those approaches to create your own, even more specific adaptation tactics. So those are the on-the-ground actions that could be implemented on your site. And the more detail that you have in your tactics, the better. Those details should answer questions like what, where, and how you would actually implement those actions. So for example, you might be thinking about maintaining or improving the ability of your forest to resist pests and pathogens. That's one of the approaches from the forestry menu. And then so you might think about your tactic and you might decide that you would like to thin to reduce density of a pest host species in order to discourage infestation based on your local knowledge that current stocking levels are too high and are making your forest particularly susceptible. You'll also want to identify a time frame for taking action. There are a few ways that you can go about that. So you might have a very specific season or month in mind for taking a particular action, or maybe you're planning to do something in combination with or in response to another event, such as a disturbance. This can be a pretty flexible section in the workbook. You'll want to choose timeframes that serve you and your goals, so you can be as prescriptive or as broad as you would like here. And then you'll also want to spend some time thinking about the benefits of each tactic and why that action would be helpful. So maybe taking that action will help address some of your biggest challenges, or it will help address multiple challenges. Perhaps it's cheap and easy, something we would consider low-hanging fruit. Maybe it has certain co-benefits, or perhaps it's just particularly likely to succeed. On the flip side, you'll also want to consider ways in which your tactic might not be so great. So what are the drawbacks and barriers that that tactic might present? Maybe it has certain negative side effects, or maybe the cost is very high, or it will require a lot of effort. Maybe you're not sure how successful it will be, or maybe there are other types of barriers like social or financial constraints. But we want to encourage you to not limit yourself right at the beginning. So start out by being expansive and really thinking about everything that might make sense. And then wait to limit your tactics until you really think about what some of the benefits and drawbacks might be for each. So going through that exercise helps you to better understand the practicability of your project. You'll want to consider both the effectiveness and the feasibility of the tactic. So when you mentally score it on those two scales, that can help decide whether it is a practical tactic to undertake or not. So you might decide that your selected tactic is helpful and relatively easy to do, but then there may be other tactics that you've come up with that you're not sure how effective they will be, or there may be some other barriers that make that tactic less practical. Rating each tactic in that way will lead you to the point of deciding whether or not you would recommend a given tactic to actually be implemented on your site. We want you to brainstorm as many tactics as you can dream up without immediately ruling them out due to logistical obstacles. So once you have a large list of potential tactics, you can go through the process we've just discussed to decide which are the low-hanging fruit, and then you can think about which tactics might be more out of reach or less feasible overall. And we really encourage you to document your thought process on why you are recommending your tactics or ruling them out. It's still useful to make note of all the tactics you think of, even if you don't plan to use them at this time, because they might end up becoming more useful or more feasible at a future time. This is also a helpful process for those of you who might be seeking funding. It helps to demonstrate your decision-making process and the multiple alternative paths that you've considered along the way. So I think that is pretty much what you need to know for completing step 4 in the workbook. But before we move on, I'm going to give just a brief example of how one group did steps 1 through 4, so you can get a little bit of an idea about that. So this is Crosby Farm Regional Park. It's part of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, which is a collaborative effort to establish a series of experimental silvicultural trials across different forest ecosystem types, and it's located in the Twin Cities metro area of Minnesota. They have about 550 acres. It's about 10 minutes from downtown St. Paul, and it's the largest natural park in the city with over 500,000 visitors annually. So the managers at Crosby Farm, for their step 1, they thought about their management goals and objectives, which included maintaining a diverse stratified canopy with natural regeneration in different age classes, as well as maintaining diverse habitat for wildlife, including a migratory flyway and pollinator habitat. They also wanted to maintain cottonwood regeneration and do some restoration and erosion control work, as well as continue monitoring and removing invasive species. So that was their step 1. And then for their step 2, they identified their key climate change impacts. So they're particularly concerned about warmer temperatures, especially nighttime temperatures in summer and winter. They're also seeing heavier rain events, wetter weather, more flooding. But then on the flip side of that, they're also concerned with potential for increased drought stress in the summer and a shifting of the plant hardiness zones from zone 5 to zone 6. They're also concerned about the potential impacts from extreme weather events such as a polar vortex, which brings extremely low temperatures in the wintertime, as well as continuing concerns with invasive species. And then for their step 3, they identified their challenges and opportunities, and they were really focused here on tree species. So the tree species currently found in the park are expected to see reduced habitat suitability under climate change, and those species of concern include northern white cedar, black willow, silver maple, cottonwood, and box elder. And they also have particular concerns with ash species decline due to emerald ash borer, and they are expecting that that species will largely disappear from the forest canopy, which I know is also a concern within Ohio as well.
Kristen, can we see the step 3 slide?
Are you not seeing it?
I don't see it unless my screen's frozen up or something. I only see step 2.
Okay. Does anybody?
Yeah, I can see step 3 slide.
Okay.
So Annie, your
see it.
internet might be slow.
Okay.
Sorry.
All
No,
right.
that's not your fault.
Okay. Well, hopefully it'll catch up for you here in a minute and you'll be able to see it. But I think
Okay,
everybody
thank
else.
you.
Yep.
Sorry.
Okay. And so
And Annie, don't forget, I'll post the slides in the newsletter, so you can go back and look at those if you need to.
Great, thank you. Okay, and so the opportunities that Crosby Farm identified, again, with relation to tree species, they're expecting that some tree species will have increased habitat suitability under climate change future. So those might be bur oak, swamp white oak, hackberry, American elm, and red mulberry. And they're also expecting that habitat suitability for tree species such as honey locust, sycamore, and swamp white oak may increase. And those species are currently found in similar floodplain forests the south in southern Minnesota and Iowa. And then for their step 4, they identified various adaptation approaches as well as more specific tactics to address their biggest impacts and challenges. So one approach they considered, which could be classified as more of a resistance type option, was to prevent the introduction and establishment of invasive plant species and remove existing invasive species. And so the specific tactics that they considered there were to do site prep for natural regeneration and planting, as well as to scout, treat, and remove invasive plant populations. And then for a more of a resilience type option, one approach they considered was to favor or restore native species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. And then the more specific tactics that would fit with that approach would be to incorporate genotypes of existing species that are adapted to warmer temperatures, and to incorporate a broader range of flood-adapted species native to Minnesota and northern Iowa. They also have a transition option here with an approach of introducing species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. And their more specific tactics there would be to promote a broad suite of future climate-adapted species, including flood and drought-tolerant species from seed zones farther south along the Mississippi, as well as considering the possibility of shifting the species composition within Crosby Farm Park to be more similar to areas in southern Iowa and Missouri. And then this is the 5th and final step of the workbook. So this is a little bit of a sneak peek. This is the step we'll be discussing next week, but that's to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of implemented actions. So for them, that's basically taking measurements of things like the overstory, seedlings and saplings, the herbaceous layer, down dead wood and soil. So again, so sneak peek of next week, but that is kind of the overview of what Crosby Farm Regional Park did for their workbook process. So I think with that, I'm turning it back over to Patricia here.
Okay, I will be sharing my screen. Okay, can you guys, let me see here. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we are coming down on the hour, but before I let you go for the day, I'm going to cover a few pro tips just to get you started in the online workbook. So these tips and much more are also accessible in the recorded tutorials that are embedded in each step of the workbook. So just log in, you can click on those videos. So first, it might be helpful to scan the multiple menus that can be viewed using the shortcut buttons, because you might find that although you're primarily using the forest or urban menu, you might also need some strategies related to recreation, carbon, or another topic. So then when a menu catches your eye, you can dive down into the specifics of that menu. You can look at the strategies, the approaches, and you can even see some example tactics along with some text about, you know, what exactly is that strategy trying to do. So once you choose a menu, so the top two that I'm anticipating you folks to choose are either going to be the forest menu or the urban menu. So you just click on one of those, you read through your strategies and approaches, you pick one or two, and then when you're ready, you're going to just click on this add a tactic button. So that's all you need to do. Click on that button, and then you're going to see this screen pop up where it's showing you which menu are you using, and then which strategy are you choosing, and then which approach are you choosing. And then because you are the one, whoops, I skipped ahead, because you are the one who is devising the exact adaptation tactic, meaning, you know, what species are you planted? When are you going in to do that cutting? When are you sending your volunteers out to do, you know, whatever it is that you want them to do, you are providing those details as your tactic. And so you want to get as specific as possible. And I like to tell people, just imagine you're sending an intern out into the field and you need to tell them what to do. Get that specific: when, where, and how they're going to do that. So you can fill out that information. You can also fill out your time frame. So that's either going to be, you know, in 5 years, or it's going to be in the spring, or it can even be in a before or after statement, before you do this or after, you know, you do that, whatever works for you. And then you'll fill out your benefits and then your drawbacks and barriers. And so there's instructions to fill out each of those boxes. And then you, as a final step, in step number 4, you are asked to decide if you're recommending the tactic for implementation. So up until this point, you are not disregarding any potential tactics. Whatever comes to mind, go ahead and write that down, because it's something that you can show that you considered. And then later, you will decide if you are recommending those tactics or not. And so you have this button, you can recommend it, type yes, or you cannot recommend it. And then if you have not recommended that tactic, you can provide additional information as to why. And this will become important when, you know, maybe some of your stakeholders say, well, why didn't you consider this? And you can say, actually, I did consider this, but it was too costly, or it would have significantly impacted this other part of my management plan, or whatever your reason is for not choosing that tactic. It's too risky. You know, we don't have enough information. That's, you know, all you need to put in that box is this is for you and your eyes only. What is your rationale for moving forward without using those adaptation tactics? And then obviously, you know, if you select recommend, then those are automatically getting carried forward for you, along with all of your benefits and drawbacks. And then just remember, you know, use that left-hand navigation panel, especially this late in the game. That is really your best friend to be able to jump around in between steps, and then use those tutorials and use those pull down menus to find additional resources here. And if you can't find what you're looking for, please reach out to Erin, Kristen, or myself, because we are always happy to help you through that. So our assignment after today is to complete your step number 3 if you still need to do that, and then move on to step number 4. So there is a mandatory short video that we want you to watch on adaptation concepts, which will help you frame your overall response. And then we want you to jump into the adaptation workbook and complete step number 4, and then the homework after step number 4. So check out your syllabus, because there are some additional optional reading and a couple optional videos. One is on forested watersheds, and I can't remember what the other one is on at the moment. But those are optional, and they're additional sources of information. So that will also go out in the newsletter. And then, yeah, give those a read and let us know if you need more information. And then looking ahead, our next lecture is going to be next Tuesday, where we'll start again with our discussion portion of class, and we'll review your step 4s. We're going to be really excited to hear what adaptation actions you've come up with. And really, we're looking for what are those adaptation tactics, those really specific things that are going to apply to your project and your project only. We're really excited to hear about those. And then lecture will introduce step 5, which is all about the monitoring portion of your project. So that will do it for today. We'll stick around for any questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for your participation, and have a great rest of your week. Questions? Bye.
Can I ask a question?
Please
Patricia?
do.